This is Tell Your Story, Alaska. We talk aviation, history, theology, but most of all, the raw stories of Alaskans and the gospel. Hey everyone, today we will be talking about how to land a plane in 300 feet. But first, I wanted to make note that this is the 30th episode of Tell Your Story, Alaska. I only just noticed that, like right before I started recording. Thought I'd mention it. 30 episodes in is a pretty cool little accomplishment. I've only been doing the podcast for less than a year, so 30 episodes is pretty great. And I normally don't get to record much in the summertime because I'm just far too busy flying, but in the winter I obviously have more time and I'm able to do more recording, which is this time of year. So episode 30 today, how to land a plane in 300 feet. Some news: I turned 40 last Monday or Tuesday. I think it was Tuesday. November 28th was my birthday. I turned 40 years old, and as a present I got to go see a physical therapist and learned that I am missing a tendon in my left ankle, which is why I sprain it so much. My ankle has been causing me pain, and the therapist looked at it and concluded that I'm probably missing a tendon, which probably broke in one of my nasty sprains. And so the advice that I've often gotten from some folks is don't get older, and that is advice I did not follow, and I'm getting older and I get to enjoy my body falling apart. So I now have a missing tendon, and I have to work those muscles which make up for the missing tendon in my ankle, and I have to do these exercises. So, starting to feel the age a little bit, but still thankful. I can pretty much do most things that I used to do. I used to run a lot. I used to go on like 20-mile runs, and I now go on 3-mile runs. Well, not lately because of my ankle, but it just comes with the age, and accepting that is a part of life, I suppose. So I'll pass on that advice to everyone else, which no one will follow, but don't get old. It is not fun to have your body fall apart. In other news, here in Alaska, if you don't live in Alaska and you're listening, the weather here has been very strange. It has been warmer here than it has been for my family who live in Michigan, which is a bit weird. We're a bit further north than them. I think they're at latitude like 35 or something, and we're at 60, 61, something like that. And actually, I have it written down. Yeah, 61, we're at latitude. And it's been warmer here than down in where my family lives in the Midwest, which is a bit odd. And we, the month of November, hit a record for the most snow in the month of November in Alaska ever recorded. I think it was like 40 inches of snow. So my snowblower has been very, very busy, but the snow seemed to suddenly stop last week, and then the temperature went all the way up to the low 40s, and all of that snow began to melt. And now everything around us is just a big sheet of ice, and I have to wear my cleats all the time. The weather has just been so wonky lately, but who knows? Every year they say is wonky, and so maybe wonky is the norm. I don't know. Anyway, I digress. Today I'd like to do something more lighthearted. In our previous, last handful of episodes have been pretty heavy. I've been telling some testimonies. Some of them were pretty dark, with a hopeful flair to it. And then we had the series of the history of the church in Alaska. If you have not listened to that, highly recommend. But regardless, the last handful of episodes have been pretty serious and heavy. And today I decided to be extra lighthearted. And this morning I went for a walk trying to decide what I wanted to do. And today is like a perfect day for a walk. I think it's 24 degrees out, so below freezing, which is preferable because then it's not slushy and wet. And so I walked across the sheets of ice out on this trail into the wilderness I like to take, and I saw a moose this morning, and it's so clear today I could see Denali. And as I record, today's December 1st. On Friday, I'll probably post this Monday morning, but a beautiful day for a walk. So as I was walking, I came to the decision to record on some short field techniques that I learned this past summer and was able to implement by landing on quite a few sandbars on the Yetna River. And I also was helping a friend with his business, flying moose, not moose hunters, but moose meat out of the bush. And I was able to use those techniques out there. So what I'd like to do is to discuss the technical techniques, is that redundant? Technical techniques on how to land a plane in 300 feet. Now, keep in mind, I'm not a CFI. I've been considering lately getting my CFI. I see a lot of neat opportunities. I actually enjoy kind of doing unofficial teaching when I fly with people. And so I've been interested in pursuing my CFI. I've made a few calls, but I'm not sure if I'm going to do that yet. It is another level of responsibility, but all the same, keep in mind, anything I talk about today, I'm not a CFI, so don't take it as gospel. Make sure if you do have a CFI, you talk to them before doing any of these techniques, because this is just something I've been learning from the past summer. Now, landing a plane, if you are a pilot, and I'm going to assume the listener is a pilot just to save time on explaining various things. But if you are a pilot, then you probably know that landing a plane is the most difficult part about flying. Taking off is relatively easy. Flying is mostly just sitting there and managing a few controls here and there. When I'm in cruise, sometimes I will let the passenger who's in the co-pilot seat, hold the yoke a little bit. I'm still in control, but I let them kind of hold the controls a little bit, and they can do it. So it's relatively easy. So take off, cruise, but then when it comes to landing, this is the thing that takes the longest to really perfect when it comes to learning how to fly. Probably if you're pursuing your private pilot license, or even if you're going for your commercial, it's landing the plane well. Spot landing where you want to land. All of these various techniques you learn, there's short field and soft field landings. These are the most difficult to perfect. And even after you get your license, it becomes sort of a lifetime pursuit of perfecting that. And even the most experienced pilots will, they call it botch a landing. But a botched landing from an experienced pilot probably looks like one of the best landings of a very inexperienced pilot, and we call it a botched landing. I don't know if that's totally true. We all make mistakes, but certainly it takes a long time to perfect this. So landing a plane is a lot like it's energy management. Maybe if you're heard from your flight instructor, I know when I was getting my private pilot license, my instructor described it this way: landing a plane is energy management. So if you consider like a manager, you probably work under a manager who's managing a company or managing a project. He has to coordinate all of the little parts and coordinate them together so they complete a task. Now, as a pilot, you are also a manager. You are a manager of various forms of energy. And what you're trying to do is to take an airplane that weighs 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 pounds going 120 miles an hour, and you're trying to get it down to zero safely with people inside of it. And so in order to accomplish that, you are a manager of energy. So if you're a pilot, that's what you are. You're a manager of energy. And if you read your POH, it's actually kind of an energy management manual. You'll see the various air speeds for various flight conditions. For example, you'll see a stall speed on there. So they'll say VSO, which, I learned it as speed stuff out, which means your flaps are out. What is that stall speed? Now, that is a point of measurement for where your energy is. And a stall is actually not even an airspeed per se. It's actually the airspeed is reflecting an angle of attack. And when the angle of attack, which is the angle between the direction of the wind and the angle of the wing, when that wing gets too high of an angle, you lose that airflow over the wing surface and it stalls. So that tends to happen around the same airspeed and in your aircraft. And so that's why we use airspeed as a number to tell the pilot that they're close to an airspeed, but it's actually an angle which causes. But anyway, the point being that this is another form of energy, and we use airspeed to measure it. And so when I'm talking about landing a plane and you're managing that energy, we're going to use some numbers. Like I do use a little bit of airspeed, but it's actually, for me, when I'm landing my airplane, I look at my attitude indicator and I'm looking for an angle, and I translate that to a sight picture. And I do use the airspeed for reference, but that's not what I'm basing it on. So we're going to kind of dive into the weeds of all of that, on how I land my airplane in 300 feet or less. And I actually do take it off. I can take off in 300 feet or less as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Okay, so obviously I'm not talking about landing a Boeing 737 in 300 feet or even a Cherokee 6. I have a Cherokee 6 that I fly, and I cannot land that in 300 feet. So obviously the type aircraft you have wildly affects if you're able to land a plane in 300 feet. If you have a Cessna 172 or something like that, it probably will not land in 300 feet. I suppose it's possible. I'm actually not really sure. It's been a long time since I've flown a 172. Great airplane, by the way. But what I'm talking about is a pretty high performance airplane that is designed for short field landing. And we're going to be talking about the techniques needed to land in short distance. And, by the way, I think my best landing was about 150-foot landing, but that required a pretty strong headwind. And I also landed on a mountaintop, and it was uphill. And so all of those added factors can really shorten your landing as well. I was also very light at the time. It was just me and a little bit of fuel. And, a friend of mine flies a bush plane, and he won the Valdez Stoll competition. He landed his Maule M7 in 98 feet, which I don't think my Maule M5 will ever do that. But what we're talking about here is we're looking for a consistent technique that will give you consistent 300-foot landings, because what you want is knowledge of what you can and can't do. If you are doing a landing, if I attempted a 150-foot landing, even though perhaps I've only done it once or twice, that's not a reliable. You don't want to rely on that if you only have 150 feet of space to land. You want to know what you can consistently do. So the number I've used is 300 feet, which really means when I'm landing somewhere, especially with my relatively less experience with this short field technique, I'm really looking for 500 or 600 feet, because there are times when, most of the time I do land in less than 300 feet, but there are times when I bounce and I end up rolling down to 400 or 500 feet. So I really want that safety margin, and until I get that much higher level of experience, will I go down to an airstrip that's only 300 feet with no overflow or no other options. And so I'm pretty conservative when it comes to this, but yet getting your airplane to do its max performance and knowing you can do it consistently can really get you into some places you would be surprised you can get into with a small bush plane. So I'd like to get into those techniques, but first, to describe my airplane, you could listen to the episode how I completely rebuilt my bush plane. I was referring to my Maule M5 235C, which means that it is a 235 horsepower with a Lycoming 0540 engine. It is normally aspirated. I wish it was injected. It's not. There's distribution issues with the fuel mixture, but that's what I have. And it performs very, very well. And it really makes an excellent bush plane. Now, people seem to have mixed feelings about Maule. I own a Maule and I fly it, and I fly it well. The people who fly the Maules absolutely love them. These planes are very well built and well designed, and they can do what a handful of other bush planes can't do. Their capability of flying heavy loads and taking off in short distances is very notable. They also have a large cargo door that makes it very accessible for loading your cargo. Notably, like this past fall, I was loading entire hides of moose in the back of my Maule, and with those huge cargo doors, it's easy to get them in there. So that's the Maule. My Maule is a Maule M5 235C, and some notable things about the Maule. It is a tail dragger. I don't know that these techniques will work with a nose wheel airplane. It certainly works with tail draggers, and we'll talk about why. My Maule has VGs, which means vortex generators, and now VGs go on top of the wing, and all they are these little pieces of metal, and they direct the airflow that's going over the wing so that the air flows straight over the wing and doesn't end up going cockeyed or sideways over the wing. When you straighten that airflow over the wing, you get much better performance. So it doesn't necessarily make your stall speed lower. It may do that by maybe 1 mile an hour or so, but that's not very notable. The notable thing about VGs is that it gives you more positive aileron control at low air speeds. So highly recommend VGs. My Maule also has gap seals. Gap seals are gap fillers in the tail horizontal between the elevators and the tail surface, and so it fills in those gaps so you don't have it smooths out the airflow over the tail surface, and it gives you better authority. And so for higher performance bush plane, the gap seals are pretty important. Highly recommend. I also have extended gear. Maule comes with kind of stubby gear. I mean, it looks like like its arms are too short when you buy an original Maule. But when you buy the extended gear, it makes them 4 inches longer. And what that does is the front of the aircraft or the nose of the aircraft stands taller, and you get a higher angle of attack. So, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, why that's important. But basically, it gives you a higher angle of attack on takeoff, which increases your takeoff performance. And it gets you a bit higher off the ground, which is just kind of nice. Okay, the plane also has double puck brakes. This is actually required for this configuration. You can do single puck or double puck. It's just the number of brake pads that are pressing against that rotor. So it gives you more friction and more braking power. This is actually really important and for the landing technique. So highly recommend double puck brakes when you're looking at your configuration. I also have 31-inch Alaska bush tires. These are great for landing on sandbars. They're great for landing on gravel runways. They're not so great for landing on pavement. Now, I do land on pavement when I have to, if there's no other option. For example, I know when I fly to Soldotna, which I do a handful of times, Soldotna has a nice long paved runway, but they also have a really small gravel runway right in the middle of the airport there. And I always pick the gravel one. These bush tires are designed for gravel landing. And if you keep landing on pavement on these, it's really hard on them. They're designed to be able to kind of drag and spin on the gravel, and that's a good thing. You want it to do that. They're designed for that. So if you are going to get the Alaska bush tires, they're great tires. They're kind of like big balloons, and they make, all of my little mistakes, it really kind of smooths them out. And it's almost like another form of suspension. They're great. Okay, finally, the Maule has a unique thing in its rudder, and I only want to talk about the rudder because rudder is very important in short field technique. In a bush plane or in a tail dragger, you need really positive rudder authority, and when you're flying at slow speeds, you have less rudder authority, and there is a technique for winning some of that authority back at slow speeds, and we'll talk about that. But just an interesting note about the rudder on the Maule. If you look at the Maule on the rudder, you'll notice a little tiny trim tab. It looks like a trim tab, and I guess it effectively is, but that little tab is attached to the aileron control. And so when I turn left aileron, that tab will move and give me some left rudder assist. And I didn't know this until recently, but that is actually a stall spin preventative measure. To get into a stall spin, you have to be at a very slow airspeed near or at a stall and be very uncoordinated, and that will cause a stall in one of the wings and not the other, and it'll induce a spin. Well, when they were producing the Maule, there is a spin recovery requirements that the FAA puts on all certified aircraft, and so the Maule was unable to meet those requirements. And so what Maule did is they put that tab in there, and which was a spin preventative tab. And it is, I actually am growing to like it. Some Maule pilots I know kind of remove that and just straighten it and leave it like that, but I'm growing to like it because when I do light turns, which is probably, if I'm looking for a landing area and I'm flying low and slow, over a river or something, and I'm doing light turns and I'm flying around, that rudder assist is kind of nice. It kind of does the rudder for me, and I can focus more on just flying around. And so I found that assist to be kind of nice. I have to be less aggressive on the rudders when I'm just kind of lazily flying. So that's just an interesting note about the Maule rudder tabs. Some guys don't like that. I have grown to like it and appreciate it. So, and I do like the thought of having a little bit of a more buffer from inducing a spin. Spins are bad. You don't want to spin in a Maule. The recovery is okay. You'd probably recover fine, but if you got into 5 or more spins, it would be very difficult to recover. So, all right. So that is the Maule that I fly, and this is the one that I've learned to do these techniques in. And so to start off, I'd like to talk about the takeoff. And now we're going to get to the landing shortly. Taking off in a Maule, I always start with 0 flaps. I hold the brakes when once I'm lined up. You go full throttle. And now in my Maule, and I think this is common for Maules, when you put in full throttle, there's a little bit of a cycle in the prop. And I've tried to play with this where I bring the prop stop back a little bit so it doesn't do this, but it seems like when I put in full throttle, the prop the RPM kind of goes up and then it gets pulled back a little bit. And no matter the adjustments I make, it seems to do it anyways for whatever reason. I don't know if it's a prop issue or just the way Maules are, but that just seems to be what it does. So when you throw in the throttle, it will kind of go through a little bit of a prop cycle where it goes high RPM, then it pulls it back a little bit. And at that moment is when you release the brakes. A concern about this is sitting there holding the brakes with your throttle thrown in is stirring up rocks. And if you have some experience in flying in the bush, you'll know that if you're, flying on gravel or something like that, you can't just sit there with the throttle on high because it'll stir up rocks, and those rocks will hit your propeller and damage them, and which is really bad. Props are expensive. But with the extended gear, that prop is pretty high off the ground, and so far you're only waiting about maybe a second and a half for that prop to cycle through, and it's never been a problem pulling up rocks. And so I'm able to hold the brakes and just wait for that prop to kind of go through its little cycle, and then I release the brakes. Now the yoke I hold it about neutral in the beginning, but as soon as I have a little bit of speed, I have some rudder authority now, and that tail this all happens very fast, but that tail will come up quite quickly, and it's probably a second or less, and I'm rotating. Now rotating is pulling the yoke back, and while I'm pulling the yoke back, I'm also pulling that Johnson bar and I'm getting the flaps down. So you're kind of rotating, popping the flaps, and it will pop up. And as you're practicing the technique, the way I figured out when to rotate is just by trying to do it earlier and earlier and earlier until when I pull back, it's just the tail wheel kind of touches. That's when you're pulling back too early. You want that tail wheel to almost touch, but it's just lifting off the ground so you can get the earliest lift off as possible. You're trying to get the wheels up, removing that drag, and you're trying to get into ground effect. And so once you rotate and you're popping the flaps, now the wheels are up and you're entering ground effect. And your biggest concern now is to keep the airplane in ground effect. If you are learning to fly right now, ground effect, it can be your greatest friend. It can also be your greatest enemy. Ground effect is like this low to the ground, not high off the ground. I think it's like half the length of the wing, but vertically, something like that is where ground effect exists. And think of it as like a cushion of air where you get better flight performance. If you climb out of ground effect too early, you're running into danger of stalling the plane because you get higher performance in ground effect. And if you're going to climb out of ground effect near the ground and you're really slow, you're just taking off, you could be going into a stall. So in the Maule, once the wheels are off the ground, I'm putting that yoke forward and I'm trying to keep the plane down in ground effect, but the wheel's still in the air. And so it's a bit of a finesse, a maneuver, but in time you do get good at it. And as I'm in ground effect, now I have no drag on the ground. I only have the air drag, and I got my flaps down. So I'm going to slowly bring my flaps back up, just slow enough so it's removing that drag, but not too fast to where it's bringing me back down on the ground. So you're just kind of slowly bringing the flaps back up to zero. And this whole time you're on ground effect, you're gaining that airspeed as quickly as possible. And, all of this happens really fast. And I remember the first time doing these, I was kind of slow and clunky, but you just got to do it again and again and again. And I compare it to, like when you're driving. You've probably driven so much that like if a car slams on its brakes in front of you, you just instinctively hit the brakes. It's like an instinct. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to go, oh, what do I do when the car in front of me is slamming on his brakes? It's just an instinct and you do it very quick. The reason you could do that is because of muscle memory. And muscle memory is very important when it comes to flying as well. It makes flying so much easier and more enjoyable. If you remember learning to fly or you're learning to fly, you probably have that overwhelmed feeling like my instructor is asking me to do 10,000 things all at the same time, and it's like way too much. But as you practice, those get better. And it's called muscle memory. You have to do it again and again and again. And when your brain learns that muscle memory, your brain takes much less effort to do the same things. And it's a bit like when you're driving. I've driven so much now, I don't even think about driving. My brain just does it. It's all muscle memory. I mean, I can literally shut my brain off and I'm just driving. When it comes to flying, it's similar in that the more you do it, the more time you have in the cockpit, the more that muscle memory kicks in, the easier it gets, and your brain is not overwhelmed all the time. You're much more relaxed. It's much more enjoyable. So think about that with the muscle memory stuff. This takeoff technique does happen very fast. It's all within a few seconds. But as you learn that muscle memory, you have to think about it less and less, and you just really get it down. And you'll find that your takeoffs get shorter and shorter, and that always feels really good. So to review, we're going to do 0 flaps, hold the brakes, full throttle, wait for that prop to cycle through, release the brakes, neutral yoke. And then once you are moving a little bit, you're going to go forward yoke, get that tail up, and now you got a nice straight angle of attack, less drag. Once you get to your rotation speed, you're going to rotate, pull the yoke back. At the same time, you're dropping the flaps as you bring your flaps down, and that's kind of a simultaneous. And then the wheels pop up, and then you want to bring the yoke forward and keep it in ground effect, and you're slowly bleeding off those flaps. You stay in ground effect until you can get to your VX or VY, depending on your situation, and you climb out. And so it's all kind of like it becomes like a smooth, continuous motion of taking off. And in time, it becomes like a beautiful work of art. And in time, it's quite pleasant to do and lovely. Okay, I realize I'm a ways into this episode, and I have not talked about what's in the title of the episode, how to land an airplane in 300 feet. So let's get into this landing technique. The things I'm going to talk about for this technique are sight picture, rudder, throttle, and brakes. I think these are the 4 key elements in landing a Maule M5 specifically in less than 300 feet. And so what I would recommend is do the thing that gets things to click for you. And so one thing that helped with, when I was learning to land a plane, I was landing okay with an instructor. It still just wasn't quite clicking to where I was getting consistent, good landings. Even though I could do it, I can do it relative. I don't want to say relative. I was able to do it safely, but it wasn't very consistently. And so to do safe, consistent landings of a higher quality, you have to have these anchor points that you rely on in your landing. And that anchor point for me is actually not an airspeed, which is often what pilots use. It is a sight picture. And so something that could help with this idea of sight picture is if you were on final approach, you set, you get told these numbers, like you're looking for this airspeed at when you're on final approach. But you want to start transitioning from looking for an airspeed to looking for a sight picture. The reason for this is because airspeeds are something that you chase. If you're too high, if your airspeed's high, you pull the yoke back a little bit, and then your number gets below what the speed you're looking for, and then you're lowering it, and then the speed gets too slow or too high, and you end up just chasing it. A way to prevent this chase is to get a good sight picture. And the way you get a good sight picture, which is like your anchor point, much better than chasing an airspeed, is knowing exactly where the end of that runway is in relation to your cowling, the top of the nose of your airplane. And so one way you can do it is when you go up, set up for yourself a really long approach, like a ridiculously long, like 2-mile approach to your runway. Make sure the airport's not too busy and all of that so no one's bugging you. If you have a nice long approach, it gives you plenty of time. You're looking for that target airspeed, and once you get it, you kind of do the chase, and then you finally get it. Now you're looking at your sight picture. How far above is the tip of your nose, or how far below or above or whatever, however it looks, according to the height of your head and the cockpit and all of that. You're looking for what that looks like, the relationship between the nose of your plane and the end of the runway, the threshold or the touchdown point, the aiming point, whatever you want to call it. You want to know what that looks like. Now you'll find once you get that sight picture down, and specifically the location of the end of the runway, your threshold, your aiming point, whatever you want to call it, once you know where that is in relation to the tip of your nose, now you fly that. And then you will find when you aim for that, you no longer are chasing a number. You're chasing a sight picture, which you will find you will be much more successful and you'll be much more stable. Now, what I do is I look for my sight picture and I use the airspeed as a reference. Yep, that's about the airspeed what I'm looking for, and it's usually within a knot, or in my case, a mile per hour or 2. And then I know I'm on target. So the airspeed becomes a good reference rather than the thing I'm relying on. It's like a confirmation rather than the thing I'm chasing. So get that sight picture down. Go up, do a really long approaches so you have plenty of time. Go slow, take your time, and learn that sight picture. For me, the sight picture thing is what made landings really click. Now that brings me to the second thing, which is rudder. Now the Maule is a bit of a stubby airplane, which means its fuselage is not very long. And the problem with a more stubby fuselage is you have less authority with the elevator and the rudder. It's just kind of stubby. There is a technique to get more rudder authority than you might otherwise at slow airspeeds, right? Slower airspeeds, less air flowing over the wing surfaces and over the rudder, and less authority. So the controls get pretty sloppy. So a very important thing, especially with tail draggers, I've heard people say, you've either ground looped or you will ground loop. In other words, everyone is going to do a ground loop. And a ground loop is just when you land on the ground and you lose that yaw control and the tail swings around. You got that heavy engine up front and you got a lot of weight up there, and it just becomes like, a physics thing, and that it wants to swing around. And if it swings around too fast, the wing can dip down. It can hit and damage the wing on the ground. So ground loops, they're not necessarily that bad if it doesn't swing too fast, but I have not ground looped before, partially because, and I'm not saying I never will, but partially because I've learned the rudder technique. And the rudder technique is simply being very aggressive on the rudders. And that doesn't mean I don't mean like pushing full right and left rudder, but what I mean is dancing on the rudder pedals. So when you dance on rudder pedals, with my feet, I'm kind of just pushing them slightly, and I'm just going left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. And it kind of is a dance. And you'll feel the airplane wiggle a little bit. But by doing that, a good way to describe it is you're activating the rudder, and it gives you positive rudder authority. And so as I'm coming down, I'm slower speed, and I've got my rudder activated. This is going to give me more positive control as I'm entering the flare and touchdown, and I can dance on those pedals, and it keeps that rudder activated, and it keeps that positive control that we want to prevent ground looping. And so typically, if I have a passenger with me who's not a pilot or is a little nervous, the dancing can be, and feeling the jiggle of the plane a little bit, can be a little bit of a nerve-inducing thing. And so as long as I'm feeling comfortable and it's an easy landing, I won't do that as much. But when I'm by myself or I'm trying to do higher performance techniques, I will dance on the rudder pedals, just left, right, left, right, left, right, activates it. It gives me more positive authority with the rudders, which with a stubbier tail wheel airplane, or even, ones with longer fuselages, you just want to have as much authority as you can at those slower speeds. So dancing on the rudder pedals is a good technique to practice. Okay, next we're going to talk about throttle. Throttle is very important with your approach path. And what I mean by that is you want a 3% angle to which is a normal approach. Some bush pilots will modify that. Some like to come in steeper, and some like to come in more shallow with more power. It's kind of a personal preference thing. 3 degrees is what they aim for with instrument approaches and a normal approach. And so as you figure out your angle and what works best, I know people have a lot of opinions about that, or coming in steeper with less power. I'm sorry. No, that's right. Steeper with less power, so you have a more of a vertical speed, or very, very shallow with more power, so you're coming in at a very low angle. So there's advantages, disadvantages to both, but that's not the point of this podcast. I want to talk about the throttle, though. What you're looking for is that nice, stable approach. They say a stable approach leads to safe, easy landings. And so that's what we're looking for. And so my recommendation is, when you are getting these techniques, similar to getting that sight picture down, give yourselves nice long approaches. Even now, I have about 1,100 hours of experience. I still do long approaches. So sometimes I'll whip it in real close, but I still like to do nice long approaches. I'm not in a hurry. Man, I'm just thankful I'm not having to drive to where I'm trying to get. I can wait a few extra seconds or minute or whatever for a longer approach. And it just provides that time for me to practice that sight picture and the rudder technique. And of course, now we're going to talk about throttle. Because once I have my sight picture, that's locked in. I'm using the yoke of the ailerons to keep that sight picture locked in place. My eyes are referencing the airspeed for confirmation. Yep, that looks correct. That's about the number I'm looking for. So that's locked in. That's not going to move. You keep the exact same sight picture. Whatever that spot is of the end of the runway with the nose of your plane is, keep it right there. And if it drifts off a little bit, you just gently go right back to it. Very small, gentle corrections. The smaller your corrections, the more accurate and smooth you're going to be. So with the sight picture locked in, now the only thing that I am changing, I'm probably dancing on my rudders, just gently a little bit, dancing. But I'm changing the throttle. Now, the thing that really helped click for me in getting this down, because to my shame, like the approach, I was kind of confused by it. I'm like, when do I add throttle? When don't I? And I just kind of sloppily brought the plane in for a really long time. And one day it just kind of clicked for me, and this is how it clicked. Okay. Your brain does an amazing job of calculating where an object will land when it's thrown. So when I was a kid, I played a lot of baseball, and when I had the baseball in my hand and I throw it, my brain can calculate with incredible accuracy how hard, what angle to throw the ball so that it lands in my teammate's glove. Or if you think of an outfielder, I remember when I was young, I loved watching the Chicago Cubs. I'm from Chicago. I remember I loved watching Sammy Sosa. He was a bit of a hero. He was one of the best hitters in Major League Baseball. And we loved watching Sammy Sosa. And not only was Sammy Sosa a really good batter, but he was a very good outfielder. And I loved watching Sammy Sosa do these amazing diving catches and stuff like that. So me and my friends just always admired him. Anyway, so what Sammy Sosa would do in the outfield, a hitter would hit the ball, and it's just the ball's way up in the sky, and that ball is going at a particular velocity, at a particular angle, and Sammy Sosa's out there. I think he played right field, and his brain is calculating the angle and velocity of that ball, and he can turn and run exactly to where that ball is going to land so he can catch it. It's an amazing thing that our brains can do. Now, if you compare our brain's capability of doing that, knowing exactly where a baseball is going to land based on its velocity and angle and all that. Mathematicians do that with calculators and stuff, but our brains do it even better. So use that same technique. You have your sight picture, you're on final approach. You have your sight picture, and the thing that's going to make your approach correct is the throttle. Now, as you're watching on the approach, you can notice that the airplane is sinking, and you can tell at the current rate where that airplane is going to land. Maybe you're going to land too far. Maybe you're going to land too shallow, and your brain can calculate that really well. The analogy of the baseball is what helped me figure this out. If you calculate that the airplane's coming in too shallow, you want to add throttle and keep that same sight picture. If you're going to land too far, you bring the throttle back so the plane settles back down into the correct angle of approach. But what you're looking at is, at my current rate of descent and movement, where is this airplane going to end up? And once you practice that and get that technique down with the relationship of the angle of descent and the throttle, and you start seeing it when it's starting to come in a little shallow, add a little bit of power. Over time, you'll find that you're going to be making smaller and smaller adjustments, because you're going to recognize that it's starting to be a little bit shallow, or I'm starting to be a little bit long, and you're going to be making smaller and smaller throttle changes. The smaller corrections you have to make, the smoother your approach is going to be. Smooth approaches are safe landings, and your passengers will be like, oh, wow, that was so smooth and easy. And the reason they'll make those comments is because you've learned to recognize where that baseball is going to land and how to adjust your throttle to that end. So that is something that really helped me with the approach. So as you're practicing that, the smaller your adjustments are that are necessary to stay in there, because you're recognizing a problem sooner and sooner, the better you get at it, the smaller adjustments are needed, and it'll just seem so smooth in time. All right, now finally, I'd like to talk about brakes, because brakes are absolutely critical to this 300-foot landing that I've been hinting at the entire time. So let's get to the brakes technique. Now, in all of my flight training, I know everyone's experience is different. It depends on your instructor and all of that. But I'll say from my flight training experience, I was never taught this technique. I suspect, perhaps it's not something that's in the CFI books, something like that. But I learned this technique for landing at 300 feet, and it requires heavy reliance on the brakes. So here's how it works in the Maule with the brake technique. Now, when you're entering to short final, in a normal airplane, the way I learned to land it was you're entering that short final position and you're getting ready to flare. Now, if I'm landing a 172 or even my Cherokee 6, the way I enter the flare is probably the way your instructor taught you, and you pull the yoke back a little bit. You're arresting your descent a little bit. You're using up some vertical energy to arrest your descent so you can get a softer landing. So you're pulling back the yoke, and you're feeling the plane slow down its vertical descent, but you're letting it get closer to the ground. And as it gets closer to the ground, you pull the yoke back a little more, and then it kind of pulls away a little bit, and you just wait, let it settle, pull back a little more, and you're almost like, pretending that the ground is lava, and you're trying to stay off the ground as long as possible, and you're slowly pulling that yoke back. And it's a bit of an art form, and every landing is always a little bit different, but that is the way I've always learned to do the flares. And you're just working that yoke back to get the softest landing as possible. And in time, you practice on where it likes to touch down. And so you practice on your flare so you get that touchdown point that you want. Now, in the Maule with this short field technique, it's going to look a little bit different. And we're going to be using heavy braking. And so when I'm entering that short final phase, the flare looks pretty different. You know, I'm kind of like closing my eyes right now, and I'm kind of landing my Maule in my head. And in my mind, it's hard to translate it to words because it's mostly a feel and an art form. But when I'm coming down into short final, I've already established my sight picture. So I've got 5 degrees above the horizon. And, you know, obviously when you get in a short final, you lose your sight picture. And it's really important that your eyes shift from the runway right in front of you and you look up to the end of the runway. This gives you a more proper and useful way to look when you're in short final. And so in that position, instead of just flaring in that already established position, I'm just going to stay there all the way down, basically to the ground. And the only thing I'm doing is adjusting a little bit of throttle here and there to adjust touchdown point. And so if you've ever watched one of those sniper movies, they say aim small, miss small. And so you're really trying to be precise using your throttle to get your wheels to touch down right where you want it while holding that same attitude, which in my case, I like to do about 5 degrees above the horizon according to my attitude indicator. I think it's the first long line on that gauge. You can go up to 7 degrees. I did one time try going up to 10 degrees, and I came in. It ended up being a very steep approach, and I was very high angle of attack. And when I was on short final, my left wing started to stall, and I could feel it tipping over that way. And so I threw in the throttle and just went around. And that kind of jostled me a little bit. And so that's made me more conservative. I've come down to about 5 degrees. I think if I really want to do the shortest technique possible, I'd go to 7, but I'm avoiding that 10. You don't want to stall. So typically I'm coming in with the Maule, and the airspeed that I usually get is about 52 miles an hour. Now, a friend of mine has a Maule M7. His gets down to about 37 miles an hour, which is quite a lot of a difference. But the M7 is just a better performing plane. It has longer wings and it has a longer fuselage, so he has better performance, but take what I can get with the plane that I'm blessed with, and it does quite well. So no complaints, only that. Those are the numbers I'm looking for, which aren't as good as some other models, but that's all right. Okay, so 5 degrees above the horizon, I'm entering short final, and as it turns out, that's a pretty good, instead of flaring, what I do is when the wheels are just pretty close to touching down, because remember, I'm using the throttle, I'm dancing on the pedals, and I'm using that throttle to get the wheels to touch down where I want. Now, when I'm really, really close to the ground, I'm just going to give it a strong puff of throttle. And that strong puff just gives that last minute bit of cushion that really, for the Maule in particular, it just gives you that last little bit of cushion that really helps it. So just a very, very quick, aggressive puff of power, and then you pull it back right away, right as you're about to touch down. Now, in touchdown, the wheels are going to touch the ground. Hopefully, you've used your throttle good enough so you land right where you want. And this is where the braking technique comes in, because when I learned to land airplanes, my relationship with landing and braking was the wheels touch down and you roll a little bit, you get comfortable, and then you just slowly bring in the brakes. Now, the problem with actually doing that, especially with a tail dragger, one of the worst times to use your brakes is near the end of your rollout. And the reason for that is, especially in this configuration of airplane with the Alaska bush tires on it, is near the end of your rollout, you're in the highest danger of flipping the nose over because you don't have that horizontal, the elevator authority to keep that tail down. Because you're going so slow, there's less airflow, you have less tail authority to keep it from flipping up and over. And when you're getting near the end of your rollout, there's still enough energy to flip the plane over. And so it's actually slightly, usually guys are careful with the brakes to keep it from doing that, but still you're at a higher danger of doing it. Interestingly, a lower danger of flipping the plane is when you're at you're on short final, you're just touching down and you're going a little faster. And if you are strong on the brakes, those Alaska bush tires on a dirt or gravel surface will slide before it flips because you have a lot of tail authority to keep that tail down. So what happens is you've worked with your throttle to touch your wheels down where you want them. And what I'm going to do is pull my yoke all the way back into my stomach, and I'm pushing the brakes really hard. What that does is it creates a tension between the tail wanting to go down and the brakes wanting to lift the tail up. And what you learn in time is there's a good balance between the two. With my tail authority, I'm pulling it back. It wants to pull the tail down. Brakes are wanting to lift it up. And just like a seesaw balances, you're able to balance it. And so what you do is you land on just the two mains, hard on the brakes. The wheels might slide a little bit, and that's okay. They're designed for that. That's why we use Alaska bush tires. So it's no problem. And when you have the tension between the two, what you are doing is with the brake authority and the tail working to keep it from going up, you've created a lot of drag. And that's what you want when you're trying to land really short. So in that configuration, it took me a while to get the technique down. It's kind of scary to slam on the brakes like that with the, pulling the tail back. But as you start practicing it and you get good at it, you learn what that balance feels like. And you're able to get down and the tail doesn't touch. You're just touching down on the mains, yanking that yoke back, slamming the brakes, and the tension between the two keeps you on the mains and you stop very, very quickly. And once you get that technique down after practice, because it is a bit of an art and there's a feel to it, you can have these nice short, less than 300-foot landings in the Maule. And it's quite satisfying when you pull it off, realizing that you're able to get into much tighter places with that higher performance. All right, so the one last thing part of this technique is if you are able, once you get that down, you want to be able to start dumping those flaps. As soon as you start braking, you want to, you're coming in with your full flaps, and so you want to get rid of those flaps. And what that does is it allows the plane to settle on the wheels, which gives you more braking authority. It really doesn't make a massive difference, but if you're trying to get max performance, it does help to dump those flaps while you're in that braking process. For me personally, I'm still working on the flap dump thing because my brain is still, very busy with trying to do the braking technique, but I'm getting there. So dumping the flaps is good. It gets the more weight on the wheels and more braking authority. And now as you're doing your rollout, you got the brakes on. You do have, as you're slowing down, you do need to come off the brakes, right? That's very important to remember. You don't just keep those brakes in. It's going to be a quick 300-foot roll, and you need to be constantly monitoring how you're doing with that balance, because as you're slowing down, you're getting less less elevator authority. And so you need to let up on the brakes as you're slowing down and keep that balance going. The better you keep that balance going of tail up with the brakes and the elevator trying to keep it down, the better at that balance you keep as you're releasing brakes, as you're slowing down, the faster you will come to a stop. So it's a bit of an art. And of course, flying is an art in of itself. But like a good artist, they have to work and work and work at their technique. And of course, when you do, just like I just think of in Genesis when God tells Adam to subdue the earth. And as pilots, we try to subdue these techniques to get better and better at it. And we are just, as people, just built to pursue excellence. And when we achieve some level of excellence, it just brings us a lot of pleasure as people. We're just built that, we're wired that way. And so I find a lot of pleasure in getting better and better at these techniques. I can probably 90% of the time land in less than 300 feet. If I am loaded up really heavy, it's going to be more like 450 feet because I'm heavy. But if I'm light, I will land in less than 300. Now, I say 90%. That's because sometimes I do botch landings. I'll bounce. And if I bounce, and I'm light, it won't be 300 feet. It'll be more like 400 or sometimes 500 feet landings, which, in the bush flying world, if you can land in less than 500, even that's considered pretty good. So 300 is really, really good. And if you're getting less than that, you are top notch, which I do fly with some people who are there, and I am working on it. So those are the techniques, and that is how you land a plane in less than 300 feet. So thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this. I know it's a lot of technique and sort of technical jargon perhaps, but for those of you who are pilots, I hope you found it informative and delightful to listen to. Until next time, this is Tell Your Story Alaska. I do have quite a few more episodes in the works that I am very much looking forward to. So keep tuning in. Thank you guys.